faithfully proclaiming the truth of the risen Christ. This is Ancient Faith Radio, timeless Christianity, 24 hours a day.
Search the Scriptures as Christ our God said in the Gospel.
This is Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Join us for an interactive verse-by-verse study of the Bible with one of Orthodoxy's most respected biblical scholars. Study along with us and share your comments and questions by calling 855-237-2346. That's 855-237-2346. Here now is Dr. Jeannie Constantinou.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Amen. Illumine our hearts, O Master who loves mankind, with the pure light of thy divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to understand thy gospel teachings. Implant in us also the fear of thy blessed commandments, that trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things that are well-pleasing to thee. For thou art the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God, and to thee we ascribe glory, together with thy Father who is from everlasting, and thine all-holy and good and life-giving Spirit, now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Well, welcome, dear brothers and sisters, to Search the Scriptures Live. I'm Dr. Jeannie Constantinou, and today's date is September 11th, 2023. This is Lesson 40 on the Gospel of Matthew. And I want to remind you, if you want to know where I'm going to be this fall, you need to go to my website, drjeannie.com, drjeannie.com. And under my picture, it says, join my email list. You click on that, it takes you to a little box where you just click inside the box and it becomes blank. Type in your email and you will get instructions on how to read the Bible according to the Fathers, patristic advice. And then also I will send you my newsletter. It did go out last week, by the way, that sort of lets you know where I'm going to be this fall. And also a little bit about what I did in Greece during this summer, and a little bit of information about something very interesting I learned in my research on my next upcoming book. So just a way for me to keep in touch with you, and then I don't have to explain all those things here on the program for people who aren't necessarily interested in hearing about those things. So we're beginning chapter 10. We're in a new subsection of the Gospel of Matthew. Where are we in the Gospel? Remember that it's divided into 5 main sections that alternate between narrative and discourse, or narrative and teaching. It's the same thing. Narrative is the story part, and the teaching is the words of Christ giving his teaching. It begins with the infancy narratives. That's chapters 1 and 2. Chapters 3 and 4 are the first big narrative section. The infancy is the introduction. The first narrative section is about John the Baptist, the baptism of Christ, his temptation, the call of the first disciples. And then the first teaching section, I hope you know this by now, it's the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5, 6, and 7. And then right after that, we go back to the narrative. That's chapters 8 and 9, which we just concluded last week. And that consists of 10 healings or 10 miracles in a row. 3 sets of 3 miracles, but one of them is a double. And what do we call that double? We call it a sandwich because it is a story within a story. So there's 3 sets of 3 stories. Notice how Matthew is so careful in his structuring of the gospel. So now we are in the second teaching section, and all of chapter 10, almost all of chapter 10, except for the listing of the 12 disciples, is actually the Lord teaching the disciples and sending them out to preach on their own. And even though it seems like it might be kind of a confusing or puzzling passage, and there are many questions that people have about certain parts of this chapter, or maybe a little bit boring because maybe you've heard it a lot and, it's not that interesting to you. Actually, there's some very, very interesting points, very interesting things we could learn in this section. And I'm hoping that we will get as far as a little bit more toward the center of the chapter, so that I can share with you a very interesting sermon by Chrysostom that talks about how the clergy was being treated at his church. Okay, so you're going to have to hold on for that. Maybe we'll get to it today. We'll see. But this section is very, very important. And chapter 10 is called, traditionally, the missionary discourse, because he's sending out the disciples on their own mission. So you're going to remember that. So just like 5, 6, and 7 is the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 10 is the missionary discourse, all right? So how was this connected to what came before? Do you remember that what happened in the first teaching section? The Lord taught with authority. That's the Sermon on the Mount. He fulfilled not only the prophets, but the teaching of the Lord, the law, by giving his own law. And it was extraordinary and amazing. How could someone just take the law of Moses and say, that's what was said before, but I say to you this? Remember that? How could he take the whole thinking of the Jewish people, which was really very Deuteronomistic? I don't know if you remember, I've used that. It's been a while since I used that term. That meant that if you believe that if you were wealthy, it was because you're a good person and God has blessed you. If you have a lot of material blessings and possessions and lots of children and good health, this means that you're blessed by God. Jesus takes that in the Beatitudes and turns it upside down. How dare he do that? Well, he did it because he had authority. How is he going to prove that he has authority? Because anyone can say anything and claim to have authority. Well, after the Sermon on the Mount, in which he teaches with authority, and the people were astonished at his teaching, he backs up his authority. He proves that he has his authority by the various miracles that we see in chapters 8 and 9. And I explained to you that's why those miracles are important, and they show that he has authority. And on a couple of occasions, people indicate that it's obvious that he has authority. The demons recognize that he has authority. They ask to be sent into the pigs. They don't go by themselves into the pigs, but they ask the Lord for permission. And in many other places, remember the centurion who says, I too am a man under authority, and I have men under me. So he recognized Jesus' authority. So the theme of authority has been continuing throughout this whole section. And as he continues now in chapter 10, he's going to give that authority to the disciples to go out and do the same exact things that he has been doing here in chapters 8 and 9. And also we could say Sermon on the Mount, because they're going to teach and preach and they're going to heal. So let's talk a little bit some more about his authority. The point is he was challenged about his authority, but now he's giving his authority to the disciples. I want to read to you what St. Jerome said about this in his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. Our kind and clement Lord and teacher does not jealously refuse to give his miraculous powers to his servants and disciples. On the contrary, just as he had cured every kind of disease and infirmity, so too he gave to his apostles the power to cure every kind of disease and infirmity. But there is a great difference between having and bestowing, between giving and receiving. Do you see where St. Jerome is going with this? The Lord has authority. Now he bestows it on these disciples. He's as God, he had authority to do all these things, right? So as Jerome continues, he says, whatever he does with the authority of the Lord. But whatever they do, in other words, the Lord is Lord, so he has his own authority. But whatever they do, they confess their own weakness and the power of the Lord, saying, in the name of Jesus, rise and walk. So this also is something that the fathers frequently mention when they talk about how the Lord healed people or how he raised them from the dead, like with Lazarus, the raising of Lazarus, and other times. When somebody else raised a person from the dead, like Elijah, he prayed to the Lord because he did not have the power over life and death. When Peter prayed over Tabitha, Dorcas, in the book of Acts, she had just died. He prays for the Lord to raise her. He didn't have authority in himself. This is what distinguishes Christ. When he prays, he has authority. He just heals. He just casts out demons. He doesn't have to pray for those things to happen. When he raises Lazarus in the Gospel of John, he prays, but he says, I'm not praying because he says, I'm praying so that people will recognize. He's praying for the benefit of the disciples. He's not praying in his prayer. He doesn't ask God the Father to give him the authority to raise Lazarus. That's why he says, I am the resurrection and the life, you see. So he has authority in himself. All right. Now, what is the context in which he's about to give authority to the disciples? This is something we finished last week at the very end of chapter 9, when it says that the Lord saw the multitudes and how they were harassed and they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he said, the harvest is plenty. Pray to the Lord of the harvest to send forth laborers to his harvest. And so that is the context in which now we transition into the sending of the disciples. But I wanted to share with you what Chrysostom said about how he sent out the disciples and why he introduces this passage with a comment about the harvest and about how laborers are needed for the harvest. Here is St. John Chrysostom. See again his freedom from vainglory. That he may not draw all men unto himself, he sends out his disciples. When he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion on them because they were troubled and scattered abroad, sheep without a shepherd. So he said to his disciples, the harvest is plenteous, but the laborers are few. Pray to the Lord of the harvest that he will send forth laborers to his harvest. Well, who's the Lord of the harvest? That's Christ, right? See again his freedom from vainglory. To signify how great the gift is, he says, pray to the Lord of the harvest. Okay, because there were just 12 of them at the time that he sends out. He made no addition to their number, Chrysostom says, that there were only 12. But from them he made many come forward. This is to signify how great the gift is. For after having said, pray to the Lord of the harvest, when they had not made any entreaty or prayer, he himself at once ordains them, reminding them also of the sayings of John, of the threshing floor, he means John, the forerunner and Baptist, and of the person winnowing, and of the chaff and of the wheat. Wherefore it's evident that he himself is the husbandman. He himself is the Lord of the harvest. He is the master, the owner of the profits. For if he sent them to reap, think about this, he's sending the disciples to reap. He's sending them to scatter, to sow the seed, and then to reap, to gather the harvest. If he's sending them to reap, clearly it was not to reap what belongs to another, but to what he himself had sown by the prophets. So the people would, knowing the Jewish people, knowing the prophecies about the coming of the Messiah, would recognize that the Messianic age had arrived, and now he's sending the disciples to reap this harvest. But in this way, not only was he indirectly encouraging them in calling their ministry a harvest, but also by making them fit for the ministry. And it says that when he called them, his 12 disciples, he gave them power over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal all manner of sickness and disease. Now, why does he do this? Why does the Lord give them this power? Think about this, because that's not how it happens today in an ordination, right? The Lord gave his power, Chrysostom said, because the Spirit was not yet given, because Jesus was not yet glorified. He hadn't died on the cross. He hadn't risen from the dead. We don't have the Pentecost. And then even before Pentecost, he breathes on the disciples, on the 11 in the upper room, and says, receive the Holy Spirit. They get a special commissioning as leaders of the church. But that hadn't happened yet. So he gives them authority in a way that is quite unique to the 12, something that we don't have today in the church in that sense. Of course, we're continuing their apostolic ministry. But the way they received that authority, Chrysostom is trying to say, was unique. All right. And mark how well-timed the mission was. For not at the beginning did he send them, when they had enjoyed sufficiently the advantage of following him. They had seen a dead person raised, the sea rebuked, and the devils expelled, and a paralytic walking, and sins remitted. So in other words, after they had witnessed all of those things that we see described in chapters 8 and 9, then he sends them out. They had received sufficient proof of his power by both deeds and in words, and he sends them forth, not to dangerous acts, for as yet there was no danger in Palestine, but they only had to stand against evil speaking. But even against this, he forewarns them. He forewarns them of their perils, preparing them ahead of time and making them feel as if in conflict by his continual predictions of that sort. So now, wandering preachers and philosophers was not unusual in the Mediterranean world. It was actually quite common. And there were lots of philosophical schools, there were lots of religious leaders and different kinds of teachings. And as you might imagine, or perhaps you should realize, that without mass communication, without even the printing press, which would not be invented for another 1,400 years, messages of this type were spread by people walking from place to place. So people were accustomed to having strangers come through the town. Sometimes they were dressed a little bit differently, and they were preaching various kinds of messages. And people would listen to them, even if for no other reason, because of curiosity, because there was nothing really entertaining. We don't have that happen very often anymore, where people will go and just hear a speaker. But people were attracted to this because they wanted to hear something new. And there was no other really form of entertainment. So people would go and they would listen to what the person had to say. So even with writing was very, very slow and laborious. Books were rare and expensive. So the Mediterranean world was filled with wandering preachers and ascetics and philosophers. Now, after the time of the church, there were many false apostles and false teachers and false prophets. And the New Testament warns against this. Paul is constantly fighting against false apostles or false brethren. He mentions this. And even in the earliest Christian writing outside of the New Testament, it's called didache. In English, they say didache. It's in English, and that's how they pronounce it. But the English title is The Teaching of the 12 Apostles. This very, very early Christian writing, it's from the 1st century, talks about how to distinguish a false apostle from a true one, how to distinguish a false prophet from a true prophet. And it's not what you might think, something kind of fancy or sophisticated. Basically, if they stayed for too long and they tried to mooch off of you or the community, they were a false apostle or a false prophet, okay? So because the prophets and the apostles were constantly walking and traveling, and if they were to stay in one place, especially the prophets, they were supposed to support themselves. But you can imagine how tempting it was for people to claim to be an apostle and to come to a new town and say, I'm an apostle of Jesus Christ, and then have people supporting them financially and living off of the community. And this happened in Corinth. Okay, now Paul took great pride in the fact that he always supported himself by his tent making. But people came after Paul, after he had established the community at Corinth, and they insisted that the community support them. And Paul said, I never asked you to do that for me. As a matter of fact, I robbed the other churches because I asked nothing from you. Now, he didn't mean he robbed them, but he was getting support from the church of Thessalonica, from the church of Philippi, to support him financially while he was ministering to the church in Corinth, okay? So these are some of the issues that happened in the early church. So you should be aware that there have always been false prophets, false teachers, false preachers, false apostles. There have always been greedy people who tried to support themselves, not because they really cared about the gospel, but because it was an easy way to earn a buck, to make a living. Okay, so this is nothing new. Don't be scandalized. This is why I'm telling you about it. We see this even in the New Testament. So don't be scandalized if you hear about this sort of a thing. So now Christ is going to send out the disciples for a kind of like field education assignment. This is something that we see in seminaries today when young men are studying for the priesthood, not only in Orthodox seminaries, but all kinds of seminaries, Roman Catholic ones and Protestant ones, and I'm sure for Jewish ones. They send the young men, or if they're women studying to be a pastor, they will send them to the hospitals to talk to people. They'll send them to sometimes, do the different kinds of field work, to parishes where they might help with Sunday school, or they might do some chanting or something of this sort. And this is like every other kind of profession where there is some activity that requires practice. So people who are training for a profession, very often they're given assignments to develop their own skills. My goodness, when I was in law school, we wrote briefs. Okay, we wrote legal documents in school. We weren't really working as attorneys. We had to get up in the class and argue a case. So that's a way of giving a person some experience while the teacher is present so they can give you feedback. Now, Jesus wasn't present with them when he sent them out, but he gave them instructions in advance, and they came back and they reported to him. And he was there, and they were able to practice the skills that they learned from the master. And then when they returned, he could advise them and correct them and instruct them. We see this, I can think of only one other instance in which we see this. Do you remember the story? We're going to come across this story a little bit later in the gospel here, in chapter 17. Where there's a boy it's called the epileptic demoniac. And this is the boy who has an epileptic fit. And Mark describes the scene very dramatically, how he falls into the fire and into the water, and he's foaming at the mouth. And the father says to Jesus, I brought him to your disciples to cast out this demon, but they were not able to. Remember that story? And then Jesus just rebukes him easily, right? And then afterwards, privately, they ask him, why were we not able to cast it out? And he says this kind can only be cast out by prayer and fasting. Or most of the manuscripts say and fasting, but some of the manuscripts do not have that part. And Father Costa always makes a big point of that. But he says by prayer and fasting. So it was a particularly difficult kind of exorcism. All right. So the point is, we do see them asking him, what about this? And why weren't we able to accomplish this? And he's giving them very practical advice. So it's not all theoretical. He's not just teaching them. He's not teaching them theology. He's not teaching about the procession of the Holy Spirit or these kinds of things. He's giving them very practical advice because they were going to go out and minister to people. So Chrysostom is going to talk about how the Lord also gave instruction to the disciples before he sent them out by his own manner of life. And I think that this is very important. I'm going to read this to you. And also I want to talk about how we evangelize today, because actually I've received some questions when I go out, because there's a lot of interest in evangelization in the Orthodox Church and in all the churches, frankly. We should never stop evangelizing, but people are a bit more aware of it now, and there's a lot more discussion about it. So the question arises, how are we supposed to evangelize? And I have people asking me about that. And frankly, and that came up a couple of weeks ago at a speech, a presentation I heard by a monk, Father Christodoulou. Somebody got up from the congregation and says, as Orthodox Christians, how are we supposed to evangelize? Because we have this idea that we're supposed to go out and be preaching on the street corner or passing out tracts or, doing something fancy. It's more on the Protestant or Catholic model. And what Father said and what I've said and what many people say, not that we're not supposed to go out and talk to people about Jesus Christ, but we don't have to follow that model. The first and most important thing we're supposed to do is live a truly Christian life. That is the greatest tool of evangelization that exists. And this is the Orthodox tradition. Okay, we don't have to copy what other people are doing. What did Saint Seraphim of Sarov say? Acquire the Holy Spirit, and 1,000 people around you will be saved. This is how, the great saints of the church, people flocked to them, and they were transformed by their experience of the saints because that one person had acquired the Holy Spirit. That's what we're supposed to do. So when we radiate the Holy Spirit in our lives, this is how we evangelize the world. People say, I want what that person has. Or you can simply invite somebody to church. What about your Easter? Why is it on a different day? Well, I'm an Orthodox Christian, blah, blah, blah. And you say, would you like to come to churches? Check it out for yourself just to see what it's like. Do you know how many people have become Orthodox because someone did the simple thing of inviting them to church? We're not all called to be missionaries or evangelists in that sense. Now, the reason why people are so conscious of this is because there is a very strong emphasis in the Protestant world about saving people, bringing them to Jesus. Now, obviously, we want everyone to be saved. We want people to come to know Christ. But you have to recognize that attitude very often, I'm not condemning everybody, but very often comes from a place of pride. I'm saved. We in our little church or our denomination, whatever it is, we are saved. What about all those people out there? We have to save them. The implication is they are not saved. They're not going to heaven because they don't believe as we do. But Orthodoxy doesn't teach that. We don't say all those other people out there, unless they become Orthodox, they're not saved. We never say that. So can you see how different the attitude is? Now, that doesn't mean we're only supposed to think about ourselves. We are supposed to be concerned for our neighbors, but we're not supposed to say, I have to save that person. First of all, we live as a Christian, and if we do, we are the best witness. And frankly, that's what the early Christians did. They were living a truly Christian life, and this is how they transformed all of the Roman Empire. Because people saw how they were behaving and they said, this is very strange. They love their enemies. They're taking care of the poor. They were living a philosophical life. They were living a life of virtue. And in the Greco-Roman world, people believed that you could not live a virtuous life unless you were educated as a philosopher. But here were these people, Christian women, and children and ordinary laborers and slaves. And they were living a life of virtue, of temperance, honesty, humility, patience, constancy, all of these things. They were living that way, and they were not trained in philosophy. And believe me, this is what got the attention of so many of the pagans. And also that they died without fear. And they died rejoicing. They died bravely, and this was witnessed by thousands of people in the arena. That's how people came to the church in the early centuries of the church. That's what Orthodoxy models. Okay? Now, I spoke a little bit too long, But I want you to understand, but I'm going to read Chrysostom after we come back from the break, but I want you to understand that the way Orthodoxy evangelizes is different from the West. In Western Christianity, the Catholic Church, I'm not saying this to bash the Catholic Church. I'm just speaking about historically what happened in the past. The Spaniards sent the conquistadors to the New World, and they conquered the Aztecs and the Incas and all these other people, and they brought the Christian religion. They brought the Padres with them, and they forced people to become Christians. And the California history is full of this. There are missions all up the coast of California. And so they conquered lands, and then they imposed the faith. And of course, Islam did this. Islam was spread with the sword. Okay, and they don't like it when you say that, but that's the historical truth. Okay, Orthodoxy has not done that. Okay, now in the Protestant world today, in many Protestant congregations, they're turning to a lot of gimmicks. In many of these mega churches, they have coffee houses, in the lobby of the church, and they sell snacks, and they have very fancy sound and light equipment, and they have stages that are very elaborate. And they're becoming like the world. They're making their worship services something entertaining to try to attract people. We have never done that, okay? That's not the Orthodox style. We don't follow gimmicks. We don't try to appeal to people with creature comforts like, coffee in the lobby and all kinds of fancy things and different kinds of gimmicks. They're very worldly. It's like a business trying to attract customers. The Orthodox Church just keeps on offering the liturgy, and that's our style. We don't imitate the world. Our missionaries came with the gospel. Our missionaries went to Alaska, for example, and they just created a mission, created a monastery, and people came to them. And that's what happened in England when Christianity was brought to England. They went to the king of the kingdom of Kent, and they said, "Can we live here?" And they said yes. And he was a pagan. And slowly they brought people to the faith by their way of life. Those monks, those first monks in England, that was the early tradition of Western Christianity. That is the tradition that Orthodoxy has always kept. Orthodoxy didn't come with an army, okay, and force people to convert. They came, simple monks came. It's the same thing in England and Germany with Saint Benedict. The early Western missionaries were like this, and that is still the Orthodox style. So when we talk about how we are to evangelize, the most important thing we're supposed to do is live a Christian life ourselves, a life of love. Yes, with concern for our neighbor. Yes, talking to them about Jesus Christ, but not trying to convert them, okay? But exposing them to Orthodoxy in the best way possible, which is by living a truly Orthodox Christian life. After the break, we're going to read about what Chrysostom says about how Christ taught the disciples, okay? So join me after the break.
Dr. Constantinou will be back in a moment, but the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
Jesus' last words to his disciples were, "Go and make disciples of all the nations." Unfortunately, many parishes are struggling to follow this commandment. In Reclaiming the Great Commission, Father Evan Armatas offers a roadmap to help us get back on track. Relying on his 20 years of parish experience, Holy Scripture, and insights from research and his visits with churches across the U.S., he discusses how you and your community can implement changes that will transform, revitalize, and renew your parish. You'll learn how to diagnose and remove the barriers you face, deal with resistance to change, define what a healthy parish looks like, lead with purpose, and create a parish health plan. Written for clergy, council members, ministry leaders, small groups, and all committed parishioners, this book will help any church in its journey to reclaim the Great Commission. Purchase it today at store.ancientfaith.com.
We're back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
Okay, so here is St. John Chrysostom, taken from his treatise against the Marcionists and Manichaeans, and he begins by they were denying the full humanity of Christ, and he was talking about how Christ became a real human being. The incarnation, he passed through various stages of human life, just as we do, and then he continues, and then he talks about how this was important for the disciples. Now, here again, notice that Christ is the example. They weren't looking for business models. How can we sell the gospel? Because the gospel, actually, although there are aspects of the gospel that are very appealing, the gospel is not easy. To truly follow Christ is not easy. So here's St. John Chrysostom. Just as he hungered, as he slept, as he felt fatigue, and he ate and drank, so also did he deprecate death, thereby manifesting his humanity, and that infirmity of human nature, which does not submit without pain to be torn from this present life. Now, he's talking about how, we haven't read this part yet, where the disciples were told not to fear death. Go out and you're going to be persecuted, but don't be afraid of death. For had he not uttered any of these things, it might have been said that if he were a man, he ought to have experienced human feelings. And what are these? In the case of one about to be crucified, fear and agony and pain, being torn from the present life. And to give assurance of the incarnation, he manifests the actual feelings of a man with full demonstration. There is one consideration, no less important. And what is this? Christ, having come to earth, wished to instruct all men in all virtue. Now the instructor teaches not only by word, but by deed, for this is the teacher's best method of teaching. A pilot, for instance, when he makes the apprentice sit by his side, shows him how he handles the rudder. But he also enjoins speech to action. It does not depend on words alone or example alone. In like manner, the architect, when he has placed by his side the man who is intended to learn from him how a wall is constructed, he shows them the way by the means of action as well as by oral teaching. So also with the weaver, the embroiderer, the gold refiner, the coppersmith, and every kind of art has teachers who instruct both orally and practically. Inasmuch then as Christ himself came to instruct us in all virtue, he both tells us what ought to be done, and he does it. For he says, he who does and teaches the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So let's pause here. Where did he say that? The person who keeps my commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. He says that in this gospel. We discussed that already. We went through that. That's back in chapter 5, in the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, after the Beatitudes, when he says, I have come not to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill it. And we discussed what that means. So he says it's not enough simply to say you believe something. You have to live in the manner that you actually show that you believe it. The one who does it and the one who does and the one who teaches will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Hearing and doing is something we're going to see a lot of emphasis on. It's not enough to hear the gospel. It's not only enough to intellectually assent to what Jesus says. We have to follow through with our actions. And the Lord gave us his example. And for that reason, we are without excuse for anything. We are without excuse because the Lord did everything he asks us to do. And this is what makes the Christian religion the greatest religion in the world. God himself became a human being and showed us how to live. And he didn't kill people. He didn't use violence. He didn't sit in a corner and just try to be enlightened himself and then sort of pass that along to others. He didn't make demands on people. He invited them to follow him, to live as he lived. This is so important. Christ doesn't order us to do anything. He invites us. If you want to, you can follow me. But this is what you have to do. You have to pick up your cross. He doesn't say, I'm going to put a cross on top of you. He says, you pick up your cross and then you follow me if you want to, if you would be my disciple. So let's continue here with Chrysostom. Now observe. He commanded men to be lowly minded and meek, and he taught this by his words, but see also how he teaches it by his deeds. For he said, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek. We saw that right here in Matthew's gospel. How does he show that? By his deeds. He said it, but did he show it? He shows how these virtues ought to be practiced. How did he teach them? He took a towel and girded himself and washed the disciples' feet. What can match this lowliness of mind? For he teaches this virtue no longer by his words only, but also by his deeds. And again, he teaches meekness and forbearance by his acts. How? When he was struck on the face by the servant of the high priest. Do you remember that? That's not in Matthew's gospel, nor is the washing of the feet. It's in John. But you know the story. When he was taken before Annas, he says, why are you asking me these questions? Ask my disciples. They heard me. And then the servant of the high priest strikes Jesus. And Jesus, what does he do? Does he strike him back? Does he spit on him? Does he curse him? Of course not. He says, if I have spoken wrong, bear witness to the wrong. But if I have spoken the truth, why do you strike me? He answers with such mildness. It's astonishing. Chrysostom is talking about that here. He teaches by means of his acts. For when he ascended his cross, he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. As therefore he commanded men to pray, he himself prays, instructing you to do so by many, many utterances of prayer. Again, he commanded us to do good to those who hate us and to deal fairly with those who treat us despitefully. He did this by his own acts, for he cast demons out of the Jews who said he himself was possessed by the devil. He bestows benefits on his persecutors. He fed those who were forming designs against him. Did you ever think about that? I never thought about that. What is he talking about here? He's talking about the feeding of the multitude, the feeding of the 5,000, the multiplication of the loaves. Do you think there were any Pharisees in the crowd who were critical of him? Yes, but Jesus didn't say, no food for you. He fed them too. He conducted into his kingdom those who were desiring to crucify him. And of course, we can add Paul, who became a great apostle, even though he persecuted the church. He entered the kingdom of heaven. So the Lord did all of these things. Chrysostom concludes, again he said to his disciples, get no gold or silver, neither brass in your purses, training them for poverty. And this also he taught by his example, saying, foxes have holes, and the birds of air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. For he had neither table, nor dwelling, nor anything else of that kind, not because he could not obtain them, but because he was instructing people to go on that path. So, you see, this is why we should never make excuses for anything, because the Lord did everything he asks us to do. He never asked us to do anything, including forgiving our enemies. So if you have that person in your life that you don't want to forgive, this subject will come up again in the gospel. But you can't say, well, I'm not going to forgive them because of what they did to me, when the Lord himself was crucified and forgave the people that did that, right? So we have no excuse. We have to live according to the gospel, and we cannot say it's too hard. Oh, it's, It's just an ideal. He didn't really mean it. That's what people say about the Beatitudes. We've already gone over that. Okay, so let's talk about the sending out of the 12. Why did he choose 12? And to answer that question, I think you know it already, but we're going to make use of Gregory Palamas. What does he say? As Jacob produced 12 patriarchs according to the flesh, from whom the 12 tribes of Israel came into being, so spiritually, Jesus gave us 12 initiates into his mystery. So remember, the 12 patriarchs are according to the flesh, but now Jesus works spiritually, and the 12 he chose for spiritual reasons. When one of them wretchedly fell away, that's Judas, of course, the great Saint Paul, upon whom Christ had looked down from heaven, made up the number. Well, yes, he's the one who usually, when we see in the churches, when we see the 12 in the churches, there's usually 6 on this side of the Archdiocese and 6 on this side, and St. Paul is always there. But the one who was really chosen to replace Judas was Matthias, of course. But traditionally, Paul is depicted there because of his great importance. If we do not see the same number of tribes originating from the apostles, that is nothing strange. For spiritual things are divided without losing their unity. In the same way, our body apparently has 5 senses, but our soul's perception is one, divided yet united. 12 wells of water by which the Israelites, under Moses' leadership, encamped and quenched their thirst after traveling in the desert, foreshadowed these 12 men. For by providing spiritual water, they delivered the human race, which had previously been walking through the trackless wastes of atheism, from the burning heat of mad idolatry. Oh, I like that. That's so great. So that's St. Gregory Palamas. So let's read from the Gospel, chapter 10, verse 1. And he called to him his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal every disease and every infirmity. The names of the 12 apostles are these. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the Cananean, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. All right, let's talk about how he gave them authority. Then we'll talk about the 12 names. So he gives them instruction in the kingdom of heaven. As Chrysostom mentioned, they saw how the Lord taught. They saw how he cast out demons. They saw how he healed people. They had experience in watching him. And now he gives that authority or that power to the 12 and sends them out to preach and to heal every disease, every infirmity, and to cast out demons. So now the names of the 12 are divided into 6 pairs. And actually we see this in all 3 synoptic gospels that describe the sending out of the 12 and list the 12. John doesn't list the 12, by the way. And there are some little differences in the order and even in the names of them. But Matthew is the only one here who describes them in this particular way. And actually, it's a very melodic, the way he does it. Simon called Peter, and Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew, James, etc. So there's a kind of cadence that we see here among these, the way they are paired up together. Now, the term apostle is used by Luke, and we often use the term disciple and apostle interchangeably, but we really shouldn't. And I want to take a moment here to talk to you about what the difference is here. And also the way the word apostle is used in the early church versus today. Today, the term apostle is basically synonymous with the 12 disciples. But these 12 were very, very important and very special in the early church because they were the closest to Jesus. They formed this inner circle of discipleship. Now, Jesus had thousands of disciples. Let no one tell you that Jesus only had 12 disciples. People like to say that sometimes, especially when there aren't too many people at church or at Bible study. They'll say, well, Jesus only had 12 disciples. But that's not true. He had thousands of followers. We know from the Gospel of Luke that there was another circle larger outside of the 12, the 70. Only Luke mentions that group. But even beyond the 70, there were thousands of disciples. What about Nicodemus? He's a disciple. And Joseph of Arimathea, he's a disciple. And Lazarus is a disciple. And Mary and Martha. There are other people, even from the Gospels that we know of, that are not listed either among the 70 or they're among the 12 or anything like this. So the 12 in the Gospels are called the 12. If you'll read carefully, especially in Luke, he calls them the 12. And even John calls them the 12. In Matthew, there are places where he calls them the 12. So that term, apostle, did not refer only to the 12. Okay? It's important that you know this because the term apostle was much greater. And the reason why I'm telling you this is because an apostle in the primitive church was someone who was an eyewitness to the resurrected Christ. And that included women. Okay? We have Junia and Andronicus, who was a married couple. We mentioned them. They're mentioned in chapter 16 of Romans. She's a woman, and she's called an apostle. And Mary Magdalene was an apostle, and so were Mary and Martha and Lazarus. They were called apostles because they saw the risen Lord after they were eyewitnesses to the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ. And St. Paul was not considered an apostle in the early church because he did not know the earthly Jesus. He met the Lord on the road to Damascus, but he saw a blinding light, right? And he heard a voice. He was not considered an eyewitness of the resurrection. He, of course, believed he was because of that experience on the road to Damascus. But in the early church, to be called an apostle meant you were and had experienced the risen Lord in the flesh. And he appeared to many more than 12 people. That's why I'm trying to tell you, or 11, because Judas, of course, wasn't alive to see that. That's why it's important that you recognize that there were many more than 12 apostles, because there were hundreds of eyewitnesses of the resurrection, the actual bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of eyewitnesses to the bodily, physical resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so that's why we distinguish between the 12 and the apostles. Now, today, when we say the apostles, we mean the 12, and that has become that's the case. But you should know the difference between how the term is used today versus what it meant in the early church. But those apostles, why did they witness the risen Lord? Because they were his followers in his earthly ministry. They knew him from Galilee, and they were his followers, and they had witnessed many, many, many things. It wasn't just the 12 who had witnessed all of these marvels. It wasn't just the 12, even who were sent out to preach, because Luke tells us about the 70 who were sent out to preach. Okay, so there were many, many, many followers of the Lord. And that's important because people will try to denigrate the resurrection by saying there weren't that many people, and they all colluded together. They conspired to say Jesus rose when he didn't. But there were so many people who were witnesses of the physical resurrection of Christ. So let's talk about these names. We're going to begin with what St. Jerome says about the names of the 12. First Simon called Peter and Andrew his brother. It belongs to him who searches into the secrets of the heart to distribute the order of the apostles and the merits of each one. Simon is the first to be recorded. He was also named Peter to distinguish him from another Simon who is called the Canaanian from the village of Cana in Galilee, where the Lord turned water into wine. He also names James of Zebedee because there follows another James, the son of Alphaeus. He is grouping teams and pairs of apostles. He joins Peter and Andrew, brothers not so much in the flesh as in the spirit. James and John followed the true Father after leaving behind their physical father. Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas too, and Matthew the tax collector. The linking of names, the other evangelists put Matthew first and Thomas afterward. Nor do they attribute to him the name of tax collector. That's a very good point. Let's pause there. Remember when we talked about the call of St. Matthew, the tax collector, both Mark and Luke call him Levi, and when he is called, when the Lord sees him sitting in the tax collector's booth or the toll collector's booth, and the Lord calls him, both Mark and Luke describe that call of Levi. But when they list him among the 12, they call him Matthew. Of course, Matthew is the only one who calls himself Matthew when he's called by the Lord in that scene, and he's of course linked here, and he puts himself second after Thomas. He doesn't put himself first. But Mark and Luke don't call him Matthew the tax collector, but here Matthew calls himself. He says Thomas and Matthew the tax collector. But notice he doesn't put himself first. They wanted to. Jerome assumes that they didn't want to. That Mark and Luke didn't want to offend him by calling him a tax collector. But this man indeed refers to himself as a tax collector and places himself after Thomas, so that where sin abounds, grace also might abound. Simon the Canaanian, he is the one who is described by another evangelist as the zealot. Now, this is kind of interesting. Why is he's not Simon the... Some translations describe him as Simon the Canaanite. He shouldn't be described as a Canaanite, because usually the term Canaanite is a person from Canaan, the land of Canaan, which is Palestine. And usually that term was used to refer to the ancient enemies of Israel, the pagan nations. And later we're going to see Matthew refer to a woman who approaches Jesus as a Canaanite woman, and by that he means she's a pagan. So that should not be translated as Canaanite. Here we're saying that this Simon, the second Simon among the disciples, was from the city of Cana in Galilee. And the ancient church tradition is that he was the groom at the wedding at which the Lord changed water into wine. That's the ancient church tradition. So he's Simon from the town of Cana in Galilee. Okay, he's not a Canaanite, so that's why here it's been translated more correctly, the Canaanian. Okay, now Jerome mentions he's sometimes called the zealot, and that's because the town of Cana in Aramaic means ardor, or defending a cause. So when they translated it the zealot, they didn't mean that he was a zealot in the sense of a revolutionary, but that he came from this town which was named for zealotry or ardent faith or extreme, so we could say emotion. So apparently the people must have had that characteristic for the town to have that moniker. So let's continue with Jerome. Because he says, in fact, Cana means zeal. Okay, that's why he says sometimes he was called, it's Luke who calls him Simon the Zealot, zelotes, but it's because the word in Hebrew, Cana, means zeal, according to Jerome. Now, here's something else he talks about. Ecclesiastical history hands down the tradition that Thaddeus was sent to Edessa by Abgar, the king of Oroson. He is called Judas, the son of James, by the evangelist Luke. And elsewhere is called Lebbaeus, which means little heart. So there's some variations in the way, not only some of the order of the names, but also in how the names that are chosen by the evangelists. One must believe he had three names. As Simon was called Peter, the sons of Zebedee were called Boanerges, that's in Mark's gospel, not here. From the strength and greatness of their faith. Judas took the name Iscariot, either from the village in which he was raised or from the tribe of Issachar, so that he was born with a kind of prophecy of his own condemnation. For Issachar translates as wages, that the betrayer's wages might be signified. Okay, wow, that's kind of interesting. So, there are other reasons or other theories about Judas Iscariot, and I describe those in my book on the crucifixion of the King of Glory. I describe in length all the various theories, and he was not a zealot. He was not a revolutionary. He's not a dagger man. That's been put to rest. Okay, so don't go with that. All right, but if you want to know more about it, you can look at the book. All right, so let us see what Chrysostom says about the names of the 12. But we're going to take a break at this moment. So join me after the break and we'll hear from St. John Chrysostom.
Dr. Constantinou will be back in a moment, but the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
So here's a question for you. What does it mean to think Orthodox? What are the unspoken and unexplored premises and presumptions underlying what Christians believe? Orthodox Christianity is based on preserving the mind of the early church, its phronima. Dr. Jeannie Constantinou brings her more than 40 years' experience as a professor, Bible teacher, and speaker to bear in explaining what the Orthodox phronima is, how it can be acquired, and how that phronima is expressed in true Orthodox theology, as practiced by those who are properly qualified by both training and a deep relationship with Christ. Thinking Orthodox, now available at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
We're back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
Okay, so you do notice, of course, that Simon Peter is listed first. He was recognized by everyone as the leader of the apostles, and then he is usually paired with Andrew, his brother. So here's St. John Chrysostom on the names of the apostles, and as he goes through the Gospel of Matthew in his sermons. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother. Even this is no small praise, for the one he named from his virtue, and the other from his high kindred, which was in conformity to his disposition. Then James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother. See how he arranges them not according to their dignity. For to me, John seems to be greater, not only than the others, but even than his brother. After this, when he had said Philip and Bartholomew, he added Thomas and Matthew the tax collector. But Luke not so, but in the opposite order he puts him before Thomas. Next, James the son of Alphaeus. For there was, as I have already said, the son of Zebedee also, another James. And so there are two Jameses, two Simons, and two James, and two Judases among the disciples. So there's also another James, and that was the brother of the Lord. He was not among the 12, but he was in charge of the church of Jerusalem. He was a very holy man. He's very important. He's the oldest son of Joseph, and he's called the brother of the Lord because he was the stepbrother of Jesus. They didn't have a common parent, but he was older than Jesus, and they grew up in the same household. So there's 3 Jameses. So if you ever get confused, you have James, the brother of the Lord. He's not among the 12, but he is an apostle. Why is that? Because he did see the resurrected Christ, and he was a follower of Jesus Christ. He is part of the early church, as are other brothers and sisters of the Lord. That's mentioned in Acts chapter 1. So we have that James, and then we have 2 Jameses among the followers of among the 12. And by the way, it's in English it's James. In Greek it's Yakovos. So it could be Jacob or some Yakovos or some variation on that. So in case you're wondering, sometimes people say, why is it translated James? There's a whole reason for it in the English language, but it's translated as James here. And then James next. This James, the son of Alphaeus, for there was, as I have already said, Chrysostom writes, the son of Zebedee also. Then after mentioning Lebbaeus, a surname of Thaddeus, and Simon Zelotes, whom he also calls the Cananean, then he mentions the traitor, and not as an enemy or foe, but as one writing a history. So he has described him. He did not say the unholy or the all unholy one, but only names him from his city, Judas Iscariot. So Chrysostom was of the opinion that Iscariot had to do with where he was from. There was you can see that in the discussion of Judas in the book The Crucifixion of the King of Glory. I do talk about how there were towns, especially one, that sounded a lot like Iscariot. Because there was also another Judas, Lebbaeus, Chrysostom mentions, whose surname was Thaddeus, who, Luke said, was the brother of James, saying Judas the brother of James. Therefore, to distinguish him from this man, it said Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. And he is not ashamed to say, who also betrayed him. So far were they from even disguising that among the things that seem to be matters of reproach. And first of all, the leader of the choir is an unlearned and ignorant man. Let us see where and to whom he sends them. The 12, it says, Jesus sent forth. What manner of men were these? Fishermen, the publicans. For indeed 4 were fishermen, and 2 were publicans, Matthew and James, and 1 was even a traitor. So as he continues, the Lord is going to tell them where to go and what to say, what to do, and also how to live, what to take with them or what not to take with them, where to stay, how to distinguish where to stay, etc. So he's going to give them a lot of instructions. And there's a lot of spiritual depth to these instructions that are very useful also for us as well, as we see the Lord living out the same kind of life. So here is St. Matthew's Gospel. We're in chapter 10, and now in verse 5. These 12 Jesus sent out, charging them, go nowhere among the Gentiles, and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And preach as you go, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. You received without paying, give without paying. Take no gold or silver, nor copper in your belts, no bag for your journey, nor 2 tunics or sandals or staff, for the laborer deserves his food. We're going to pause there because it goes on. But it's quite fascinating that he not only tells them not to take extra clothing or even a walking stick, not to carry a bag, not to take any money at all, and not to receive any money at all. But you have received, freely give is the way that verse is usually translated. So let's go and take it step by step. First of all, where does he send them? Not to the Gentiles or to the Samaritans, but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And this is actually all of Israel. Okay, not just, and notice, remember that this is following what the Lord said. He saw the crowds that were pressing upon him, all the people who wanted him to heal them, who wanted to hear his words. And there's only one Jesus, and there's thousands of people who wanted his help. So he said he saw them, that they were harassed. They were like sheep without a shepherd. So pray to the Lord of the harvest to send people for the harvest. So that connection here is to sheep. Go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and go to everyone. Okay, so they're not supposedly just looking for lost people, but to everyone. Okay, to all of Israel. Now, why does he say not to go to the Samaritans, not to go to the Gentiles? Because they really could not have I'm getting a little message from Father Costa. Okay. I'm going to continue. Father Costa gave me a beautiful little message here about what happened to the 12. Thanks for that, Father Costa. You should see how he comes, because now we're live on Facebook with video, and he's afraid to be seen on camera because he's not, dressed up for a camera. And he comes into my office with a stick, and he gives me this piece of paper with tape on the sticks. So that's why I'm laughing. I did mean to give you this information about the apostles, but I'm going to save that. What happened to the apostles? Where did they go? Thanks for that, Father Costa. I don't know if we should do that now. Let us. I think I'll save that for next week, because I'm here talking to you about the next part of the lesson. But he says not to go to the Gentiles or to the Samaritans, but only to the Jewish people. In other words, this is Jesus' mission historically was focused on the Jews. And why is that? Why is it that when that man, or those men, in the case of Matthew, we have two of Gadarene demoniacs. Remember the man who was living among the tombs, or the men living among the tombs? They want to come and be followers of Jesus. Why does he say no? Go back to your village and tell what God has done for you. He couldn't have people follow him who were Jewish. There were expectations that they would go into the synagogues. They would go into the temple, and that would not be possible if the person wasn't Jewish. So it was not the time yet for the Gentiles to join the church. That would happen later. The first people that he had to speak to, that he had to teach, that he had to minister to, that he had to come to, were the Jewish people. And St. Paul talks about this, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. He says that in the book of Romans. Jesus came first for the Jewish people. They were the ones who were promised the Messiah. And then the rest of us were added on. We were grafted on like a wild olive tree. We were grafted on to the cultivated olive tree. So this is why he sends them only to, and I think historically this is true, okay? They were the ones who were promised the Messiah, and the invitation went to them first. Then after the resurrection, there is the Great Commission, which is to all people, that the disciples are sent out to everyone, but not this first time. Okay, so as I said, thanks, Father Costa, for giving me this beautiful little summary of what happened to all of the 12, but we're going to talk about that next week. So what were they supposed to do? He says, as you preach, go, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. What did Jesus preach? He said the kingdom of heaven is at hand. He said, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So when the Lord first begins preaching, his preaching is exactly the same as that of John the Forerunner. It's not different. So there's a continuation. John was preaching to people to repent because the kingdom of heaven was coming, with the Lord coming in the flesh and him beginning his ministry. But this really shows us that we don't have a disconnect between what John was doing and what Jesus was doing. They both had the same purpose, and that was to bring people into the kingdom of heaven. So this is what the disciples were supposed to preach, and I'm sure they were supposed to say more things than just that. Don't think that they were just repeating over and over, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. I'm sure they were preaching other things. They were probably telling the same parables that the Lord told, because they had heard him tell them over and over and over again. So how were they going to convince people that the kingdom of heaven was at hand? How did the Lord convince people? By the miracles. By the way, later we're going to talk about, probably we're not going to get to it at this lesson, but one of the extraordinary things that Chrysostom talks about when he talks about how the clergy are not well treated by their congregations, he talks about why there aren't many miracles today like there were in the apostolic time. So I don't think we're going to get to that today, but we will maybe next week. So they're supposed to preach and say the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And how are they going to manifest that? How are they going to indicate that? By healing the sick, raising the dead, cleansing lepers, and casting out demons. Can you imagine that? The 12, we don't know any of these stories. What happened when he sent them out? They raised people from the dead. They cleansed lepers. They cast out demons. They healed sick people. All of them, including Judas Iscariot. Yes, he did. That's one of the things that makes his betrayal of the Lord so amazing, so extraordinary. And why none of us should think we stand lest we fall, because any one of us can fall, just as Judas did. Judas Iscariot, right? So he tells them what to do, what to say, what to preach, and gives them this authority to heal the way he healed, to heal lepers, even to raise people from the dead. It is quite extraordinary when we see this actually happening. So now, he also gives them instructions. What does he say? So first of all, let's take a look at what Chrysostom said about their preaching. He says, preach and say that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Do you see the greatness of their ministry? Do you see the dignity of the apostles? Nothing that is of object sense are they commanded to speak. In other words, they're not supposed to speak about material things, about this life, but only about the kingdom of heaven. They're not supposed to speak about the law, not as Moses spoke, but the prophets before them. But if something new and if something strange, for while the former preached no such things but earth and the good things of the earth, this is a very important point. The prophets preached about the things of this earth, and so did Moses. And the laws that Moses gave had to do with this life. But they are preaching about the kingdom of heaven. So I don't know if you heard that knock on my door, but Father Costa is telling me to read about the 12 apostles. So that is what I'm going to do. As a good wife, I'm going to be obedient to my husband. And I'm going to respect what he asks me to do right now, even though I wasn't going to talk about this, but it will make him happy. So here we go. So, of course, we're going to talk about what happened to, where did Peter preach? Where do we get this information from, by the way? Besides the fact that what happened to the apostles is preserved to some extent in the lives of the saints, it is also preserved in some apocryphal writings. And there are some writings about the acts of various apostles, the acts of Philip exist. As a matter of fact, that was thought to be lost. I think that it was the Acts of Philip that was discovered by one of my professors at Harvard. It was Dr. Bovan, who was a Lucan specialist, and he was visiting Mount Athos and came across, and everybody thought that the Acts of Philip had been lost. In other words, it's the story of the life and the ministry of St. Philip, the apostle. They thought it had been lost, and he was going through the library one of the libraries in one of the monasteries in Mount Athos, and he recognized what he saw. It was just another manuscript there with so many other treasures there, and he recognized it, and he published it, so that's available. But there's Acts of John, there's Acts of Peter, and some of these stories may be legendary, but probably a lot of them have a lot of historical truth behind them. So some of the stories about where the apostles went and some of the information about them has been preserved in these apocryphal writings. Also, of course, we have in the lives of the saints, and also the person who recorded much of the history of the early church, which is Eusebius of Caesarea. He tells us a lot about who went where and the kinds of things that they accomplished. Peter, of course, is the most famous. Of course, he preached in Palestine, and in Antioch he was very closely associated with Antioch, and of course eventually he got to Rome, where we know that he died as a martyr when he was crucified upside down. There's different stories about why he died this way. The most popular is that he felt unworthy to die the way Jesus did, so he asked to be crucified upside down. Of course, Andrew, his brother, is famous for evangelizing in the area of Byzantium, and Andrew is the patron saint of Constantinople, of our ecumenical patriarchate, as Peter is the patron saint of Rome, and so is Paul, because both were martyred there. Andrew, of course, also went to Greece and Cyprus. He is associated with Scotland, and I think a lot of the British people or the Scots like to say that he went there. I think it's quite unlikely that he went there, but a lot of people claim that saints went to parts of Northern Europe. It seems quite unlikely, but we can't say it's impossible. He is the patron saint of Russia also, and he was crucified on an X-shaped cross. And so this is the cross of St. Andrew. So because he is the patron saint of Scotland, and the Scots had on their flag an X because they recognized him as their patron saint. And St. George, who was not one of the 12, of course, is a patron saint of England, and they just have a regular cross for St. George. When England and Scotland got together and unified, they imposed both of the crosses together. They put the English cross like this and the X-shaped cross of Andrew like this, and that's why that's why it's called the Union Jack. They brought those two nations together, Scotland and England, and that's why you have that symbol on the British flag, on the flag of the United Kingdom, I should say. Okay, so he was crucified in Patras, and his skull is in Patras in Greece, on an X-shaped cross. Matthew brought the gospel to Ethiopia and to Egypt, and he was killed with a spear by a king, King Hyrcanus. Judas, this is all from Father Costa's research, by the way. Judas, the son of James, took the gospel north to Edessa. Actually, Jerome just mentioned that. Oh, that's something else. That's another way that we know about some of the stories of what happened to the 12, because they're mentioned in various fathers of the church. He went to Edessa, and the symbol of Judas is a club, because the tradition is that he was clubbed to death for his faith, where he had healed the king of Edessa, Abgar, but he eventually was clubbed to death. So, by the way, you know that for all of the martyrs, the symbol of their martyrdom is how they died. And the first symbol of St. Peter was an upside-down cross. You see that symbol in some churches. Some people today use that as a satanic symbol, but that was the earliest symbol of St. Peter, the upside-down cross. So don't get freaked out if you see that in a church. Okay, but the symbol of an X is a symbol of St. Andrew, because he died that way. A wheel is the symbol of St. Catherine, because she died on a wheel. A sword is the symbol of St. Paul, because he was beheaded with a sword, etc. So James, the brother of John, is the patron saint of Spain and Portugal. You know, the Camino, that's a very famous walk that people walk, is a page to go, the Camino of San Diego, and James Diego, as you can hear how it sounds like Jacobos. So that's a pilgrimage that many people, especially Catholics, take. It's a very long walk. So St. John, the beloved disciple, visited Asia and Byzantium and Patmos, of course, where he spent some time in exile, and he was, of course, was identified with the Church of Asia. Philip went to Syria and Asia, and he was crucified in Hierapolis in Phrygia. John, of course, one of the 12, the brother, the son of the beloved disciple, he was the only one of these not to die as a martyr, but he died as a very old man. We talked about his life and his death when we discussed the gospel according to St. John and earlier in Search the Scriptures Live. So, but John, even though he didn't die as a martyr, he suffered a lot for Christ. And one of the reasons why there was a kind of minor tradition that John died as a martyr. And the reason for that is because when James and John both go to the Lord and they say, we want to ask a favor from you. And Jesus says, what is it? Now, in Matthew's gospel, it's not James and John that ask the question, but it's their mother that asks that they be given the places of honor next to Jesus, to be seated at his right and his left. But before Jesus answers that question, he says, can you be baptized with the baptism with which I'm going to be baptized? Can you drink the cup with which I must drink? And can you be baptized? They said, yes, we are able. They had no idea what he was talking about. But of course, James does die as a martyr, but John does not. And he says, yes, you will be baptized like this. You will drink this cup. You will be baptized this way. So because James dies as a martyr, but John does not, some people felt very uncomfortable with that. And there was a story that was invented that John also died as a martyr. But the overwhelming tradition in the early church is that John lived to be a very old man. And he died as a quite old man. He does not die as a martyr. But nonetheless, he was baptized. And he drank from the cup. He had that baptism of fire because he lived so long, that he lived a very long life and suffered a lot for Christ. In some ways, maybe more than the others, probably not more than Paul, but definitely he suffered a lot. And he was even thrown, the reason why he was exiled, by the way, rather than just being killed, is that he had been thrown in a vat of boiling oil. And he didn't die. That's why they decided to exile him instead. That's how he ends up on Patmos, okay? So, little bit of a sidetrack there. Nathaniel may have also have preached in India. He was beaten, crucified, and beheaded, and also went to Armenia. Thomas, of course, is famous for preaching in India. And there are a lot of Indian Christians who call themselves Thomas, and they have a very strong devotion to him, and we know exactly where he went. And he was, the tradition about his death is that he was killed by a spear. Simon the Zealot, or Simon from Cana, went to Egypt, Persia, and North Mesopotamia. And there's some people say he may have gone to England, but I don't know. I shouldn't be expressing these doubts, but I'm not so sure about some of these traditions. I think that was really the church in Europe that wanted to lay claim to some of these apostles. It's extremely unlikely that they would have gone to these places. James the Less, or he's called James the Less, now he's not, of course, this is not one of the 12. He's the brother of the Lord, of course. He was the first bishop of Jerusalem. He was stoned to death. He also evangelized Persia. Of course, we know what happened to Judas Iscariot. He committed suicide, unless you read the book of Acts, in which he fell headlong and his bowels burst open. Matthias was the one who replaced Judas, and he went around to the area of Caspian Sea to Ethiopia, and also Bartholomew. There's some confusion about the fact that we have Bartholomew listed here among the 12, but also in the early part of the Gospel of John, Nathanael is mentioned, and Nathanael is not among the 12, but John doesn't list the 12, so Nathanael may not have been among the 12. But Bartholomew is said to have gone also to India, Armenia, Ethiopia, Pisidia, Parthia, and Mesopotamia. So there are many, many traditions about these 12, and we've come to the end of our time. So when we resume next week, we're going to listen to the Lord instructing them about not to take anything with them. Can you imagine going on a trip and not taking anything with you? Not a single cent, not one penny, not one dime, not to carry a purse, not to carry a backpack, not to take extra clothes, not to take a sweater, not to take anything, not even a walking stick, he says. Take nothing with you. Don't carry a bag. Some people have said that this is because some of the wandering philosophers used to walk with a walking stick and they would carry a bag. And Jesus wanted to differentiate the disciples from these wandering cynic philosophers. It might be that, maybe partly, but probably not, because what the Fathers tell us, what Chrysostom tells us, is that he was teaching them how to depend on God for everything. But how were they to live? Where would they work? What would they, where would they stay? How would they choose what house to stay in? And what if people didn't accept their message? What were they to do? And then after this, the Lord tells them that they're going to face opposition. They will be persecuted. What should they do when that happens? So there are many, many, many instructions that the Lord gives in this part of the Gospel of Matthew. But we'll have to continue this next week, and I hope you will join me at that time. Now let's close with our prayer. Lord, now let your servants depart in peace according to your word, for our eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all people, a light to enlighten the Gentiles and the glory of your people Israel. Amen. Good night.